The errand's ground lies at the heart of Newtown in Johannesburg. It was renamed the Mary Fitzgerald Square back in 1939. This in honor of the first women trade unionist who played a key role in the 1910 miners' strike. Now launched by President Thabo Mbeki back in December of 2000, a crowd of more than 20,000 had gathered here and listened to the best of South African jazz. Now the square, which is thought to be the best venue for public performances and gatherings, is now just a space, this amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So, bonjour, dumela, and welcome. I am Dumela Mototwane, and this is #Africa. Ending July on a high note, Amina Mohammed is one of the early frontrunners to become director of the World Trade Organization, which is a body that has never been led by a female nor an African, a first of many for Africa.
The World Trade Organization has never been led by a woman or an African. But Amina Mohammed is hoping to change all that. She's Kenya's candidate to replace Brazil's Roberto Azevedo as Director General of the body that deals with the rules governing trade between nations. And she's emerged as one of the early frontrunners, although weeks of campaigning lie ahead. The reform-minded minister told Reuters that a closed-door vetting session last week went really well as she outlined her platform to steer the organization out of crisis, from global trade tensions and rising protectionism to a lockdown-induced dive in business.
I think the rule book needs to be upgraded, and if it's not upgraded, issues will continue to occur. The negotiating function of WTO has faltered. We need to revive that so that members are actually sitting in rooms discussing and negotiating.
For Mohammed, a former WTO chair, a top priority is the resumption of the appellate body. The United States has paralyzed the WTO's main appeals court by blocking the appointment of judges after complaining that it has overreached its mandate. Mohammed, who is seeking Washington's support, expressed some sympathy with the criticism.
I think the concerns that have been raised, they would not have been raised if they did not have solid reason to raise them.
But Mohammed is not the only African woman delegates say is a favorite for the top job.
We need an institution that can promote a rules-based system.
And she will need to win over those nations from the continent who have expressed support for Nigerian economist Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. The process of seeking support was underway in Geneva last week, with countries hosting cocktail parties to show off their nominees. The WTO will eliminate candidates in batches, starting with those least likely to win consensus from the WTO's 164 members.
31st of July is Pan-African Women's Day, and 2019 marked the 57th anniversary of the Pan-African Women's Organization, also known as PAWO, the specialized agency of the AU dedicated to gender equality and women's empowerment. Now, with the pandemic still a concern, what role do African women play? Now, Dr. Shakira Chunara, who is the African Union and Youth Advisory Council member, joined me earlier on in the week for a quick chat. Dr. Shakira Chunara, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to #Africa. I want to kickstart a conversation with the impact of COVID-19 on the continent, but particularly focusing on African women. How would you describe the effects or rather the impact of the pandemic?
All women are obviously not the same, and we do have different experiences, but at the same time there are things which we all experienced during lockdown. A UN Women report, I find, it really hits the nail on the head. And the reason I say that is because it talks about how us as women carry up to 3 times more unpaid labor. So that's the labor we do in our households. During this time, the care for children, the care for elderly, the care for the sick, the disruption to reproductive health services is a big one. So access to contraception, even though things are being signed and pushed into effect, we're finding that women are unable to have a hysterectomy, for example, in these times. And then also moving on, I'd like to touch on the employment element of this. And a lot of women, up to 75% of women on this continent are in the informal sector. And within the sector, we see the domestic workers, the agricultural sector. And these women were immediately affected by lockdown compared to some of us, it may take a while to kick in. And linked to this, much of the work I do on the continent with adolescent girls and young women, already they were dropping out of school. But now with lockdown, education being impacted, the access to contraception, it's likely that they may never return to school.
And that's just one aspect of it. Then you find other issues, Dr. Shunara, such as gender-based violence in South Africa being, I would say a hotspot for GBV, particularly at this time. Tsagofa Tsopule just coming to mind as one of the victims that has been, highly reported on. But also when you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, the First Lady of the country, Madame Tshisekedi, they're raising awareness around issues of GBV. Has the pandemic amplified those stats around gender-based violence? Are more and more women finding themselves falling victim of predators and perpetrators during this time?
So even though COVID-19 is new and something we've never seen before, there are previous pandemics to look at or outbreaks to look at. And a lot of the research shows that under the outbreak situation, there's an immediate spark in GBV. And I was quite privileged to have been part of various Ebola discussions in 2015. And a healthcare worker from Sierra Leone talked about how quarantine facilities means that women or patients experience GBV. Now, are our healthcare facilities prepared for this? Our quarantine facilities prepared for this? No one's asking this question, right? That's the one. The DRC, which continues to be, trodden on in various ways, but also really affected by outbreaks and pandemics. Under the Ebola situation, there were reports of medical doctors who would extort young women for sexual favors before they provided healthcare or before they provided medication. So that's what you see. In Kenya and Nigeria, there's been a 37% spark, but we also know that the figures are never, ever accurate. The underreporting is there as well. And I'll end off talking about my colleague, Simon, in the African Union, who's a refugee himself, but works in these refugee settings. And we caught up recently, and he was explaining to me how even aid workers who are supposed to be delivering food or delivering other necessities are extorting women and girls for sexual favors on this continent. And that's something no one's talking about, but it really hits home.
Yeah. And speaking of that, the 31st of July, this year, we would be celebrating and further commemorating, African Women's Day. As the AU organization, what are some of the strategies that you have in place, particularly for this year, to bring, relief to African women when we look at some of the socio-economic challenges with which they are currently faced with?
The AU's focus on gender is long-standing. For example, on reproductive health, we have what's called the Maputo Protocol. Even in the Africa Youth Charter, there's specific attention to women being paid during maternity periods, for example, which people don't know. So there are these really landmark progressive policies that the AU pushes in place, and that's its main role, but also through working with member states and regional bodies, of course. The AU does mainstream, and it has a gender-specific department, but it mainstreams gender within different parts of its work. So whether it's internet technology, this year the AU overall theme of the year is peace and security. The AU chairperson has committed to getting gender parity within the AU, which I understand is very, very low, and I'm not sure of the exact statistic, of course, but what does concern me, and I need to speak frankly on this, is how we're performing. It's one thing to have policies in place, it's another thing to have impact on the ground. And Aspiration 6 of Agenda 2063, which talks about the commitment to African women and girls, or young people as well, we've only scored 38% on the performance index. So that's representative of where we stand on the continent. Again, as a public health expert, I'm quite critical of what's going on at the moment. So if you look at most of the AU responses, the continental strategy, the COVID-19 fund, it's a little bit gender blind at the moment. And we need to be able to push the trajectory with that a little bit more. And that would be my message for this day.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shakira Chinar, for joining us. We appreciate your time. Herders in West Africa are caught between a rock and a hard place. Now, climate change has made grazing land too dry for Bobaka Mokaila's livestock, while conflict is making it harder for him to travel elsewhere for greener pastures.
Boubacar Mukaila says it used to be rare to see his animals die from hunger. But today, two forces beyond his control are putting his livestock and his livelihood at risk. Climate change has rendered grazing land in Niger's Tillaberi region too parched for his herd to feed, and conflict has made it too dangerous for him to head for more fertile pastures.
Not long ago, my children used to go as far as Azawad to graze our herd. There was good grass there. But now we have to stay here. We're too afraid of getting attacked if we move the herd.
A report by the International Committee of the Red Cross last week said that of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change globally, 60% are affected by armed conflict. In the Sahel, that includes attacks by militants that have increased over the past 2 years, as well as age-old tensions between farmers and herders that experts say have been exacerbated by dwindling land. At the same time, Sahel temperatures are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average, according to the United Nations. Hassoumi Djibo Diallo is head of Niger's Herding Association.
With climate change, there's not enough fodder, and the animals are concentrated in just one area.
He says the presence of armed groups in the Tillaberi region, which borders Burkina Faso and Mali, has drastically reduced access to pasture land.
Climate change will be felt everywhere.
The ICRC's policy advisor, Catherine Lone-Grayson, says armed conflict hinders a state's capacity to provide support for those suffering the effects of climate change and limits humanitarian access.
An already poor population becomes even poorer.
The ICRC warns that without urgent action, 200 million people will need international humanitarian aid by 2050, double the figure for 2018.
And still to come, South Africa's major wine exporter is battling with too much wine. We'll give you those details when we return. Too much of anything is bad, but too much wine is just not right. And in this case, Distel, which is a major South African wine exporter, is battling with the glut of wine. Now, the abundant harvest, together with the lockdown restrictions, has hampered their exports.
At first, it might not sound like a problem, but at a centuries-old vineyard overlooking South Africa's Drakensberg Mountains, they've got too much wine. Prestigious brands such as Nederburg are bottled at the vineyard in Paarl, just outside Cape Town, to be shipped worldwide by major South African exporter Distel. But amid an abundant harvest and global lockdown restrictions, the shipping can't keep pace, leading to a glut that sits maturing at wine estates.
It's a massive problem. It's a structural problem that could take at least 2 years to resolve.
Distel Chief Executive Richard Rushton says there's around 240 million litres of excess wine across the Western Cape, of which Distel accounts for 40 million.
And that's wine that we have to find ways to either sell or use in different forms in order that we solve a particular problem for the farmer and I guess for the whole industry.
South Africa has seen one of the world's strictest coronavirus lockdowns, including a ban on the sale of alcohol, which was reimposed this week. Rushton says the bans have stopped them from exporting as well as selling domestically. In June, he told an investor call that the impact on prices could be severe, and that the company had lost some of its listings in wine outlets abroad as exports were halted.
Without those sales, we've simply had a build-up. Post the harvest season this year, we've had a build-up in supply of wine.
Rushton said he hopes online sales will help, and Distell has also begun producing alcohol-based sanitizers, as the company grapples with a situation perhaps unprecedented since the founding of the Nederburg estate more than 200 years ago.
While everyone is making it a priority to protect themselves against the coronavirus, epidemiologists, that is Folasado Fadare and her team, are searching for those exposed to COVID-19.
Meet Nigeria's disease hunters. Epidemiologist Folasade Fadare and her team make up the country's few contact tracers. Riding their van through Lagos, they find those exposed to COVID-19, isolate them and trace those they've been in contact with. But with infections on the rise as lockdown measures eased, the team is overwhelmed, receiving updates about infected people as late as midnight and struggling for space to isolate them.
But at times, even when you have symptoms, the place is filled up. And we are like, please, just stay in your house. We are looking out for symptoms, for place. Once you get space, we come and pick you. So we have situations like that.
Nigeria's experience with infectious diseases meant it could quickly mobilize veteran epidemiologists like Fadare, along with medics and community volunteers.
We now found out that it was positive.
But Fadare says nothing could prepare them for this epidemic. Lagos, the epicenter, has 200 tracers for a population of 25 million. That's fewer than 1 per 100,000 people. For volunteers like Dr. Femi Adewuyi, it's a 24-hour job.
I usually just put a mattress on the floor and come to sleep in the office, then shower and go back to work.
Adewuyi volunteered to document the activities in and around the infectious disease hospital in Yaba, though he quickly moved to the front line as cases spiraled. In his studio, he looks through photographs from the isolation center. One shows a man unconscious in an ambulance who died the following morning.
We didn't know what the symptoms were, and the next day he passed on. So it's one of the, and eventually by the time the results came out, we discovered that I was also COVID positive. So
it's one photograph amid Nigeria's more than 33,000 cases of the new coronavirus, showing how, as lockdown restrictions continue to be eased, Fadare and Adewuyi's work is more important than ever.
Hygiene is the order of the day in Ivory Coast as residents queue in numbers for a special hand wash service. A hand washing station installed just outside of Bingerville Market can tell if the water tank is running low and how many people have washed their hands.
Outside the bustling Bingerville Market in Ivory Coast's capital Abidjan, people are queuing to wash their hands at a hand wash station with a difference. But this one is what its owners call intelligent. Set up by NGO My Dream for Africa Foundation, the station has sensors that, for example, measure how much water there is in the tank. But the Swiss-funded foundation's Secretary General, Sore Toure, says there's another important application.
It also tells us the number of people that wash their hands. That's really interesting because it allows us to study behaviours and to provide palliative solutions according to the actions of the populations.
Toure says the data will tell officials if people are following sanitary measures as the country battles the coronavirus pandemic, so they can redirect the message if it's not working. With more than 2,000 infections and dozens of cases reported daily, the West African country is yet to control the outbreak. Bingerville Mayor Yusuf Doumbia says the market is the biggest in town, with around 500 people coming in and out each day, placing the hand-washing station at a strategic location. The NGO hopes to have the hand-washing stations available in all 10 of Abidjan's municipalities.
Now, after the break, a global movement campaign co-founded by Bono to end extreme poverty and preventable diseases is bringing artists across the African continent together. This is #Africa. Let's now take a quick look at news making headlines across the African continent. One has assembled some of Africa's top artists for a musical collaboration that calls on people to stand together for the safety of all as the world fights COVID-19.
Music has a way of cutting through to people, particularly to audiences. So what we did, we called it an anthem because we want people to be able to sing along, because we want people to be able to get inspiration. And so the text, the tagline is very clear. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. We wanted that message to cut across, to reach everybody, to know that whatever you do, solidarity is important, is needed. Otherwise, you cannot finish, deal with the virus in one place and then think that you will not, then you are safe. As long as the virus exists in one country, anywhere on earth, nobody is safe. And that message we want to cut through. And the only way to keep that message coming back again is when you're singing it. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And when you say it, it may resonate with you, but sometimes it's gone. But when it's a song, it keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. And that's exactly what we wanted to cut through. And again, because we're trying to reach, the policymakers to get them to understand that you cannot work country by country. You have to work together. Otherwise, your working will be in vain, because as long as the virus exists in one country, no other country is safe. And so we wanted that to come in, to get into the consciousness of people. And that is why a song was the preferred medium of delivering that.
And that's it from me, Tumelo Mototwane. Remember to keep the conversation going online. On Twitter, we are at Africa_ENCA. Well, of course, we'll leave you with these beautiful pictures from the beautiful continent of Africa. But on that note, it's cheers from me. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.